Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a pleasure to add my own very warm welcome on behalf of the management team to this year's annual general meeting of shareholders. What I want to do over the next half an hour is really just talk about two things. I want to provide a bit of a summary of the year that we've just had. And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the 12 months or so ahead. We've got a lot of things happening really quite imminently, so I want to spend a little bit of time looking ahead to some of these items. What I'm going to suggest is that perhaps we try and keep questions to the end of the presentation just to keep up the flow, unless there's any points of immediate clarification. But I'm going to start by talking about the last 12 months, and it's been such a busy year for the company that I think it's only really at an opportunity like the general meeting that we get the chance to really reflect on all the things that have been achieved over the last 12 months. And so I want to spend a bit of time going through that. It starts for me, I think, always with a sense of the clinical development programs. So as I think everybody in the room will be aware, we have two high-quality cancer drugs in clinical trials right now, GDC84 for brain cancer and Cantrixil for ovarian cancer. And within the GDC84 program, we're looking both at primary brain cancer, so that's brain cancer that starts in the brain, and we have two clinical studies going on here. And we're also looking at secondary brain cancer. That is brain cancer that's spread from elsewhere in the body to the brain. And we have three clinical studies going on there. And I'm going to touch on a couple of these. We won't have time to go through each of them in detail, but I want to zoom in on a few of these. We do, of course, have the Cantrixil program also going on in parallel. We have a phase 1 study there in ovarian cancer. As the chairman mentioned, we met yesterday with the lead investigator on that study and had overwhelmingly positive feedback. So that was really encouraging to hear. I think what strikes me about this program as somebody who spent most of my working life in drug development is really the breadth and depth of what we have going on here. This is a program I think that any big pharma company would be very satisfied to deploy in terms of a new drug. And I think particularly with GDC84, it's worth stressing that each of these trials is really an opportunity for us to win. We only need one of these fundamentally to work for our company to be off to the races. So we have built into the program this real spread of risk, this real sense of multiple shots on goal. And I think that's one of the most exciting things, particularly about the GDC84 program. Speaking as a CEO, the other thing that really excites me is that we're only really fully funding two of these studies. You can see here the GDC84 study and the Cantrixil study. These are owned and paid for and run by Kazia. But the other four studies that we have going on are all funded either by the institutions that are running them or by grant funding. So we have, if you like, a sort of 6-for-2 leverage in the clinical program. We have an opportunity to really deploy a world-class pharmaceutical company grade program for the cost of a small biotech company program. And so I think this is really something that we're all very proud of in the company as this has taken shape over the last 18 months or so. Let me zoom in on a couple of these studies. I'm going to start here looking at our Glioblastoma study, the leftmost study on the slide here, because as you'll be aware, we're going to be reporting data from this study next week. And so I just want to say a little bit about that study as a refresher. The purpose of the study is really quite specific. It's looking to bridge the original Genentech phase 1 study, which was conducted in very, very late stage patients, to the newly diagnosed patients that we're looking to develop the drug in moving forward. So this is a study that's really looking to slightly reposition the drug, if you like. And there's two parts to it. The first part, step 1, as you see here, is looking to find what is the right dose for these newly diagnosed patients. We've completed that. And we've already reported, I think in May of this year, that we've achieved a dose of 60 milligrams for these patients, which is higher than before. And that's good news because generally speaking, with most cancer drugs, a higher dose represents a better opportunity to deliver efficacy. We're now recruiting this expansion cohort, shown here as step 2, and this is really looking to pick up signs of efficacy for the drug in this patient population. I'll say a bit more about this study later in the presentation because, as I say, we do have an important data readout coming out in just over a week. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. The other study that I think is really super exciting here is the Alliance study in brain metastases. This study started up back in about July. And it's funded by the US National Cancer Institute. This is the US government body that's been behind the development of many important new cancer drugs over recent decades. And what's interesting about it is this study is looking at 3 different drugs, a drug from Eli Lilly, a drug from Roche, and our GDC84. And it's categorizing patients according to the genetic profile of their tumor. So this is really very, very cutting edge science. This is absolutely how people think cancer should be treated in the 21st century. And we're very proud to be part of this very august company. It's funded, as I say, by the National Cancer Institute. It's led by Professor Priscilla Brastianos at Harvard Medical School, who's an absolute rising star and a world expert indeed in this field. And there's a little profile of her actually in our annual report for reference. The other study I'll just touch on is our partnership with St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, looking at the drug in DIPG. This is a rare childhood brain cancer. As we've noted previously, the life expectancy for patients with this disease is about 9 months, and there are no FDA-approved therapies for this drug. It is a rare disease, thankfully, but it is the kind of opportunity where if we are able to move the needle for these patients, even slightly, the extent to which this will open doors to fast-track the registration of GDC84 cannot be overstated. So this has a huge strategic significance for us, as well as an opportunity to just make a difference in one of the most serious forms of cancer. So we've already reported some initial safety data out of that, again, dosing to start with, and we're looking hopefully early in the new year to start seeing some initial signs of efficacy from this study. So it's another study we're really excited about. Meanwhile, we haven't been neglecting the preclinical development of the drug. So in parallel to these human studies, we've been doing a certain amount of work in animals and in the laboratory to improve our understanding of the drug. This is a poster presentation in DIPG that was published from Professor Matt Dunn's laboratory at the University of Newcastle. It's very dense and complicated, so I'm not going to go through all the detail of it today, but the upshot is it showed very, very powerful evidence of GDC84 being efficacious in animal models of DIPG. So if this data is reflected in the clinical studies we're running, I think this will be incredibly exciting. Similarly, some data that was published earlier this year in breast cancer brain metastases, that's to say breast cancer that has spread to the brain, from a team at Harvard Medical School, also gives us very, very powerful signals in favor of the drug, and we're now looking at that in a clinical trial. So I think this kind of preclinical data really just helps to encourage us that our drug is active. It helps to support the clinical studies we're doing, and it helps, frankly, to take risk out of our programs as we move forward. So we've been sharing this as we go along in newsletters and in other forums, and it's important to just stress that there is all this work going on in the background. In the broader environment, the PI3K inhibitor space has evolved over the time we've been working on GDC84. As you'll remember, GDC84 is part of a class of drugs called PI3K inhibitors. And there are now 4 FDA-approved PI3K inhibitors. You see here along the top drugs from Gilead, Bayer, Novartis, and Verastem. So this has become a very mainstream form of cancer treatment. 4 FDA-approved therapies really represents quite a breadth of different drugs in the market, in the hands of clinicians. I remind you that the unique feature of GDC84, the thing that sets it apart from every one of these other drugs, is its ability to cross the blood-brain barrier, its ability to get into the brain. And of course, for the treatment of brain cancer, that's a critical thing. So we're feeling very, very comfortable that the wind is blowing in our direction, if I can put it that way. This is a class of drugs that's become increasingly validated, accepted, and proven, but we continue to have a very, very well differentiated drug candidate in our pipeline. And I think that's a great place to be. And I think one of the things that's been encouraging in a more corporate sense is that some of these efforts have really started to engage with the broader community. I think GDC84 has always been an exciting drug to scientists and to clinicians. I think we've begun to capture the imagination of a broader constituency over the last year, and we've put enormous effort as a team into really getting our story out there. This is just a select list of some of the outlets and publications that have picked up the GDC84 story over the last 12 months. You can see there's a lot of coverage recently on the Channel 7 Sunrise program, Channel 9. We had a piece in the Australian Financial Review a couple of months ago. Some more specialist publications here, and indeed some of the mainstream broadsheets. So we're getting the story out there. It's starting to get into people's minds. It's starting to get some traction. Now, there's always a lag between, frankly, that public awareness starting to reflect in investor behavior. But I think this is a very, very positive sign that what we're doing is beginning to attract people's notice, both here in Australia and, I should say, overseas, because there's been quite a bit of international pickup here as well. And we continue to really try and access all outlets and all channels to put our story out there and to get the company in front of people. Everything from investor newsletters, TV pieces, interviews, print media. We've really invested a lot of time and energy in communicating the company's story. And as I say, I think that's been starting to get some traction, particularly over the last 12 months. We had an incredibly gratifying recognition just a couple of months ago in Auckland. We were announced as one of the inaugural winners of the Australia-New Zealand Leadership Forum Trans-Tasman Innovation and Growth Award. This is a very prestigious award for the company. It's something that recognises the most innovative and most enterprising, most promising companies on both sides of the Tasman. It's presented, as you see here, by the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and by the Australian Federal Trade Minister Simon Birmingham. And I think it really meant a lot to us, frankly, because it shows both the recognition of the efforts the company have been making, but also I think the hope that we try and offer to patients through the work we're doing. What I said in my acceptance speech for this award was that the purpose of our company, the vision, if you like, for Kazia, is that we would love to see cancer become a disease that really means nothing more to patients than an appendicitis or a dental abscess or an ingrown toenail. And we're a very, very long way from that in brain cancer, but I think, and in ovarian cancer, but I think the progress we're starting to make here really points to the opportunity that's in our pipeline. So this was a tremendously welcome recognition for us. Financially, I won't labour the details here, but I think I'd just like to reflect that we continue to run our company with a very, very tight economy. More than 2/3 of every dollar that is in the company goes directly to our R&D programs. We spend very little on the corporate overhead and on those other activities, and we really do run a very, very lean ship. And as I say, in our clinical program, 4 out of our 6 clinical trials are largely funded by external sources of funding, and I think this represents a very, very kind of unique leverage for our organisation. So that, I think, is a brief whirlwind tour of 2019, and as I say, I'd be delighted to answer questions in a few moments here. But before we get there, I'd like to maybe just make a few comments about the months and the year ahead. The chairman noted in his address that really the best is yet to come for the company. I think that's something all of us in the organisation firmly believe. The reality of drug development is that it's a process of long and arduous investment of time and money and effort in the programs that late in the game starts to reward us with data. And we're now at that point for Kazia. I think the last few years has been a process of very hard work, very deep investment in our clinical program, and we're now starting to see the results of that work coming through. So let me touch on a few things to look out for as we head through the rest of 2019 and into 2020. The first thing to say is that GDC84, our lead program, will be going under a new name, which we'll start to adopt formally from the 1st of January. And that name will be Paxalisib. Now, I should explain a little bit where this comes from. The reality of drugs is that they go through at least 3 names in their development. Most drugs start out with an internal code number because they're often one of several hundred molecules. In our case, that is GDC84. And GDC actually stands for Genentech Development Corporation, which just reflects the origins of the drug. And most drugs sort of continue to go under a code number until about phase 1, phase 2. About now, as you're really starting to make a decision to take the drug forward towards registration, a drug acquires what we call an International Non-Proprietary Name, INN. And this is a formal chemical name for the drug. It's awarded by the World Health Organization. It's not chosen by us. And it actually applies to any manufacturer who ever makes this chemical. So in the fullness of time, if other companies end up making the drug, it will also be called Paxalisib. Examples of this are drugs like paracetamol. We see many companies make paracetamol. They're all called paracetamol because that is the INN for that particular drug. When we launch into the market, when patients can buy our drug, when physicians can prescribe it, it will have a commercial brand name. An example of that is Panadol, which is a specific brand name for paracetamol. We don't yet have that because we're still a couple of years away from that stage. But I think this is a nice milestone for the drug. It's something that we tend to celebrate in big pharma companies as a kind of coming of age of a drug in development. And I highlight it here because, as I say, from the beginning of next year onwards, you'll see us using this drug this name in our communications. And as we move into 2020, I think we're also going to be looking at some new developments in the trial program. So just to orientate everybody, this is the typical development of a new drug. It goes through a period of preclinical development, which is typically about 4 to 7 years in length. And then clinical trials of typically 8 to 10 years, and then it's launched into the market and becomes a commercial product. It's a long sequence of events. We are here, essentially. We're pretty close to the end of phase 2 for GDC84, for Paxalisib. And our plan for next year, our aspiration is to take this drug into a phase 3 clinical study, a pivotal study for registration. And that really puts us on the home stretch of the drug development program. And I think this is something that I really want to stress to shareholders and to investors, is that we are very, very much closer to the end of this process than the beginning. We're within a couple of years, potentially, of having a marketed product. And that's a point where really the game starts to get quite serious, both in terms of the opportunity for investors and the work of the company. So this is a very exciting time for Paxalisib. This isn't something that's off in the distant never never. This is something that is really starting to get very real for our drug. In the meantime, as we've noted a couple of times, we will have an important data readout coming at the end of next week, and this will be presented at the Society for Neuro-Oncology annual conference in the United States. Now, the Society for Neuro-Oncology, or SNO as it's usually called, is the premier brain cancer meeting in the world. It's the one event that all the brain cancer specialists in the world try their best to get to every year. We've been in attendance for the last few years, and as I say, all the clinicians will be there. And we actually have not one but 2 presentations around GDC84 at SNO. The first one is a presentation of data from our ongoing phase 2 clinical study in glioblastoma. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the moment. The lead author on that will be Professor Patrick Wen at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And that's going to be our initial interim efficacy data for this study. We've already shared some safety data earlier in the year, which has been very positive. But this will be our first glimpse of efficacy data from this study. So it's a very, very important moment for us. And so that will be coming out next week. It'll be in the form of a poster presentation with some accompanying activities. For completeness, there will also be an oral presentation by Professor Ben Ellingson from UCLA in Los Angeles. And he's going to be doing some very, very sophisticated computerized imaging analysis of some of the original phase 1 data. He's gone back over that data, looked for signals to understand how the drug works, and he'll be presenting that data in an oral presentation. And an oral presentation at these conferences is very prestigious. It's something not many presenters get. So it's a sign of how exciting this work is from a scientific point of view. I will be completely transparent with you and say the second presentation will be highly technical. I am actually a co-author on the paper that accompanies it, and some of it goes over my head. So this is going to be really quite detailed work. But the poster presentation will be hopefully a more accessible piece of information and is a critical point for us in the development of the drug. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about what to expect from this poster presentation. Now, I want to begin by just saying that I don't yet have full visibility to the data that we're going to present. We are still cutting the numbers, we're still doing the analysis, and that's usual. Usually these things are quite last minute. We want it to be as up to the moment as possible. We're looking at all the different ways we can present the data. The clinicians are reviewing it. So I say that to basically say, please do not read into my comments any particular inferences about the direction of the data or what it may show. Quite apart from anything else, I have kept myself somewhat insulated because I have a terrible poker face and I don't want to give away any spoilers here. We will all find out at the end of next week how this data is looking. But I think we learned a little bit the hard way with some early Cantrixil data that when we just release this data into an unprepared market, people sometimes don't know quite what to make of it. So I want to just maybe offer a few general contextual comments to help set the landscape for how to interpret this data when it comes out. The first is to say that when we look at efficacy data in cancer studies, there's a whole range of different endpoints that we can report. Endpoints are just measures of how well a drug works. The most simple ones are what we tend to refer to as patient-reported outcomes, things like pain or use of other drugs like steroids. And these are useful pointers in the early development of a drug that it works, but not ultimately definitive. We also sometimes talk about biomarkers. These are often blood tests and chemicals. For example, PSA in prostate cancer, CA125 in ovarian cancer, even FDG PET, which we've looked at in our own brain cancer studies, is a biomarker. And these are sort of indirect measures of how well a drug works. And all of these things are what we call exploratory. None of them provide a rock-solid basis for a drug to get approved. No drug will ever be approved on these kinds of measures. But they do give us early signals that a drug is working. The next order of clinical trial endpoints is what we call tumor response data. So this is looking at, essentially, does the drug make the tumor grow or shrink? And this is where we often talk about measures like complete response, stable disease, partial response, so on, these acronyms here. And this data is important. This is typically what we have from a phase 2 study. It's also very, very, very rarely a basis for FDA to approve a drug. It's a pointer rather than a final definitive readout. The gold prize is actually the data points that sit at the top of this tree, progression-free survival, which is really a measure of how long a drug delays the progression of cancer, how much time it buys a patient, essentially, and overall survival, which is, put very simply, how much a drug is able to extend a patient's life. And these two endpoints are really the kinds of endpoints that any cancer drug needs to generate to satisfy FDA that the drug is suitable for approval. So ultimately, the end result of this, the game that we have to win, is in overall survival and progression-free survival. Now, Honestly speaking, for a phase 2 study, the study that we're running, and for an interim readout on a relatively small number of patients, it is little short of miraculous if we're able to present data for survival or progression-free survival at this stage. We will be analysing all these endpoints, and if we've got anything useful to say about them, we will absolutely put it in front of people. But I think we have to recognise that for most drugs at the stage of GDC84, the stage of development is that we sit roughly in the middle of that hierarchy. So I say that just to contextualise the sort of data that we'll be presenting here. As I've said, phase 2 studies typically are looking at this sort of tumour response data. We're actually very lucky with GDC84 that we have very, very good quality tumour response data, even from the phase 1 study, very positive in its impact. So if we can build on that in the data that we present next week, then I think that will be great. And ultimately, as we transition into phase 3, what we will one day need to show for the drug is a benefit in terms of progression-free survival, PFS, or overall survival, OS. Now, what are the benchmarks? How do we know what's good? In a phase 3 study, what we usually do is to run what we call a randomized controlled trial. So we give usually half the patients our drug, GDC84, and we give the other half some kind of control, and we see if our drug looks better on that. Now, most cancer drugs at this stage of development only run single-arm studies, and indeed our study is only a single-arm study. So we have to compare to results in other studies, and that's completely normal, and that's perfectly fine at this stage of development. And realistically, the prognosis for brain cancer, sad to say, has not changed in the last 20 years, so we're very confident in doing that. To give you some benchmarks for those kinds of endpoints I spoke about, if we look at the Genentech phase 1 study, we had 26% of patients with a metabolic partial response on FDG PET. That was one of these biomarkers I spoke about. It's a sign of the biological activity of the drug. About a quarter of the patients in that phase 1 study showed that effect. Very positive signal. If we have something like that in the phase 2 data, that'll be great. 40% of patients had stable disease. This is the tumor response data. This is whether the tumor is growing or shrinking. Again, a very positive outcome. And again, if we're starting to see something directionally similar in these newly diagnosed patients, that will be terrific. And then as we really, probably for future reference more than anything, if we look at progression-free survival, the existing standard of care, the only FDA-approved drug for these patients, is a drug called temozolomide. And in the patients that we're looking at, it extends progression-free survival from 4.4 months to 5.3 months. Frankly, a matter of weeks. So if we're able to see a progression-free survival figure ultimately that's out beyond 5.3 months, that will be an absolute slam dunk. You know, if we can get out to 6 or even perhaps 7 months, that will be just an incredible win for the drug. And in terms of overall survival, the benefit there is from 11.8 to 12.7 months, again, a matter of about 2 weeks or so. And ultimately, if we see patients surviving out beyond that sort of figure, beyond about 12 and a half months, that will be incredible for the drug. So now I do, again, just want to set expectations very carefully and say that very, very few drugs at our stage of development on the kind of study we're running are able to show the kinds of benefits on the right side of the chart here, but I just want to provide the sort of total context of what the reference point is. So that will be coming out at the end of next week, and we'll all be watching it very carefully, and I think this will be a very, very important inflection point for the drug. So I think we're very excited to see what comes out here. I think one of the reasons we're excited is that obviously these results translate into value for the company, investment opportunity, and the opportunity to offer benefit to patients. But I think it's also worth reflecting that as we bring new data out for our drug, it also alerts other larger companies to the value of what we're doing. Data is typically the key driver of partnering transactions in our industry, and we've been very transparent all along that our business model is ultimately to look for a good quality pharma company to partner the asset with and to take it to the finish line. And I've just shown here a sort of a select list of some recent transactions in our space. These are, the top table here shows some licensing transactions over the last 9 months or so. The lower table shows some acquisitions, some M&A transactions. And I put this in, obviously every transaction is different and unique, but I put this in really to give people, I suppose, a sense of what the opportunity for a successful biotech company looks like. We're seeing, particularly in oncology, licensing transactions in the several hundreds of millions in value, and M&A transactions often in some multiple of that. And as I say, this is a select list. It's worth noting that 2 of the companies in the licensing transaction there, Redx Pharma and Silence Therapeutics, have Ian Ross as the chairman, so we're in good hands in terms of having access to that recent expertise. But I think that it sort of starts to define some of the aspirations for us in the medium term for the company. And as I say, the data that we report over the next few weeks and the next few months will really enable and empower those discussions. So finally, just to summarize a few things that I think investors should look forward to. As I say, it's been a very, very busy year, but there is a lot ahead of us. By the end of this month, we will have interim efficacy data for paxalosid from the phase 2 study in glioblastoma. We do have, as you will have seen, an extraordinary general meeting of shareholders taking place in December. This is purely to ratify the recent share placement, and not something we propose to talk about in detail today, but obviously happy to answer questions as needed. We'll be reporting our financials in February, but then pretty early in 2020, we're expecting a rich flow of new data, both from the Cantrixil program and from the GDC84 program. And as I say, each one of these really helps to build the momentum in the drug. It helps to attract the interest of investors. It helps to enable our discussions with partners. And it helps us to get closer to the ultimate goal of putting forward a powerful new drug for patients. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for all your support over the past year. I think we've been making enormous progress as a company, and I think we have a very exciting future ahead, and we're grateful to have you to share it with us. You'll see in some of these slides and in the data we present next week, we refer to unmethylated MGMT promoters, which is one of these very opaque scientific terms. What this refers to is that if you look at patients with glioblastoma, which, as you'll recall, is the most common and the most aggressive form of brain cancer, roughly 2/3 of them have this unmethylated MGMT promoter. That's a genetic switch in the tumor. And those that have the unmethylated MGMT promoter, 2 out of 3 patients, will not respond to temozolomide, essentially. They are resistant to temozolomide. So you see here these very, very modest benefits, 4.4 to 5.3 months. That essentially reflects the fact that the drug doesn't really work in these patients. I mean, it adds a couple of weeks, but it's rounding error. So Mark, that's right. So the unmethylated MGMT patients, they are resistant to temozolomide. Those are the patients we're targeting for GDC84, and that's the group of patients we've got in the phase 2 study at the moment.
So what is the outcome for the methylated?
It's better. So the survival figure increases from 15 to 21 months for the methylated group. So if you're in the 1/3 of patients who respond to temozolomide, then your survival increases from 15 to 21 months. So it's about a 6-7 month benefit. And the base is higher, 15 versus 12 months, because actually those patients just do better anyway. but also the drug does offer benefit there. And so we're not including those patients in our study. We're not including those patients in the GDC84 study. Right now, we think temozolomide is the best option for those patients. We're just going after the 2/3 of patients who will never respond to that drug. There's two broad ways to value a biotech company at the end of the day. You can look at comparative companies. You can look at other companies with a drug targeting a disease like brain cancer that's in late phase 2 development. And most of those companies realistically are in the United States. Some of them are private. Every company is different, but usually those companies are worth between $200 and $500 million as a crude rule of thumb. And they go up and down as they report data, and you know, as I say, every company is unique, so the comparison is never perfect. But that's often the best way to value an early stage biotech company. The other approach is to do a more bottom-up approach and to say, well, how many patients are there with the disease? What does it sell for? And so on, and build that up. And there's analyst research out there that we put on our website from Edison Research that does exactly that. They've done the maths and they've worked out what they think the company's worth on that basis. And they refine that every quarter or so, and as I say, that information can be downloaded from the website. So I think as we learn more, as we get closer and closer to the finish line, those sorts of forecasts and expectations get more robust. But absolutely, it's something that can be done. The question was around our plans for future financing activities. Now, we just raised $4 million in an institutional placement just a couple of weeks ago. So I think the great news is that the company's balance sheet is quite robust at the moment. That sees us through at least the next 3 or 4 key data readouts in the company's programs. And so, and that's very consistent with how we've tried to finance the company. I think you see sometimes companies go out and raise $30 million at a huge discount and then sort of think, goodness, what on earth are we going to do with the money? We've taken a very, very different approach in Kazia. We've looked to just raise what we need. We've tried to be very, very sensitive to the interests of existing shareholders, and we fund to inflection points. And I think it's been sort of quite a positive endorsement of that in our last 2 rounds, both the one just a few weeks ago and the one we did last year, we've had very strong institutional support for those. We now have 5 very good quality institutional investors on the registry, and I think that encourages us that the work we're doing is attractive, it is appealing to professional investors. So I think we start from a very, very strong position, both in terms of the fundamental investability of the company and in terms of the strength of the balance sheet. Now, in terms of where we go next with this, as I say, the data that the funds that we raised recently see us through, as I say, 3 or perhaps 4 key data readouts over the next sort of 6 to 9 months. It's not a given, actually, that we then need to raise more money to take the drug forward further. I think it's very, very possible that somewhere along that way, some sort of partnering transaction puts us in a position to have that work largely co-funded. We've been extremely successful in recruiting other people's money to develop GDC84, if I say so myself, and we would certainly like to continue to do that. Now, we need to do that in a way that maximizes value for our shareholders. We don't want to sell the farm at an early stage and give up all the upside, but at the same time, if we can share that and share the risk, then we're very alert to that. So I think some of these data readouts will be crucial in terms of just driving those kinds of discussions. So frankly speaking, it is not a certainty that we will be the ones to take GDC84 forward to the finish line, and it's certainly not a certainty that we'll be the only people to do that. I think everything is possible. And we do continue to look at opportunities for things like grant funding and so on as well that could mitigate a good part of the cost of what we're doing. You know, we actually was just on a call with around that earlier this morning. So we look at all options, and I think at this stage everything is on the table. We're in the fortunate position of, I think, having choices and having opportunities, and I think as the data emerges over the next few months, we'll see what looks to be the best way forward. Sure. So the question was just around the commercial terms of our arrangements with around the 4 clinical studies that are co-funded. The precise detail of this we haven't disclosed, just frankly out of respect to the institutions themselves. To put it very bluntly, this is not something they do all the time, and so we don't want to give the game away for them, as it were. But I think broadly speaking, we go into these arrangements with a couple of absolute requirements. One is, frankly, that we have full access to the data. So if we see useful signals out of any of these studies, we have the ability to use that for regulatory purposes and for future development of drug. Secondly, we have full ownership over intellectual property. We have the ability to, we have the unencumbered ability to take the drug forward. And third, frankly, we're not paying anything on the back end for these studies. There's no royalty arrangements or anything of that sort. So we have, I think, a good deal around these studies. I think we have access to some of the best researchers in the world in a way that represents very modest cost to the company, both now and in the future. So the question again for anybody who didn't hear was just why raise money now? Why not wait until? Well, and I think there's probably a couple of reasons for this. I think one is risk mitigation, frankly. I think we just, whenever you have data coming out, it can go a lot of different ways, and you just want to have as much flexibility to move as you possibly can. And that's to move in a positive way as much as a negative way. I think it's possible that coming out of this, there's very near-term opportunities for further work, further analysis, further marketing of the company and the drug. And we want to make sure that we have dry powder to do that. I think we want to just have as much flexibility and agility to respond to this data as we possibly can. And so I think that's a big part of it. I think whether the data is positive or whether it's inconclusive, and realistically those are the main options at this point. But whether it's positive or inconclusive, I think we just want to be able to respond without having to worry too much about the money. I think the other consideration is a little bit of a practical one. We'll be presenting this data roughly at the end of November. The following week in the US is Thanksgiving. We then have about 2 weeks potentially where the markets are open for business. And then there's Christmas, there's New Year, there's Anzac Day here in Australia. December and January is a terrible, terrible time for a company to be approaching the market, no matter how positive its data is. So realistically, the next sort of opportunity is probably somewhere around February or thereafter. And although, as I say, we manage our finances very cautiously, and we probably could do that, you never want to get too close to the empty mark on the fuel dial before you start looking to go to the market. I think that puts you very much in a price-taking position, which is not where we want to be. It's always easier to raise money when you have money than it is to raise money when you're close to your limit. So I think because of all those factors, and we debated this very carefully as a board, but because of all these factors, we thought it was that the best way forward was to do a modest placement now, just to make sure that the balance sheet was very robust as we go into this and as we go into the end of year hiatus, and that was the most prudent thing to do. I think the final thing I'd say as well is there's a longer term play in this, which is that the share registry we've inherited, I suppose, from the history of Novogen has been driven very much by retail investors, by individuals who have been incredibly supportive of the company and who've brought it to the point it's at today. And that's enough to get a company to a 30, 40, even $50 million market cap. But to make the next leap for the company to become a $300, $400, $500 million company, it will have to have the support of institutional investors. No company can make that transition purely with retail shareholders. So we have been following a longer-term objective here of trying to bring those kind of investors into the company. And so when we do a placement, and this has been true of our last 2 placements, obviously we're very attentive to the need to bring capital into the company, but we also look at this as an opportunity to bring institutional investors into the company. And both of our last 2 placements have been very successful in that regard. And as I say, that's really a question of setting ourselves up for the future. That's not necessarily something that makes a huge difference today or tomorrow, but it does mean that as the company hopefully goes through this growth trajectory, that institutional support is there. So there's a bit of a longer term play in this as well. I think, so the question again was around Cantrixil and just where it sits in things. I'd say it's absolutely not the poor cousin. I think we're very excited about the Cantrixil program. As the chairman mentioned, we had a great meeting with the lead investigator on the phase 1 study yesterday. He was literally bursting with enthusiasm. I think we have to reflect that Cantrixil is at an earlier stage of development than GDC84. It's much nearer the beginning of its clinical program than the end. As I say, GDC84 is hopefully about to embark on the last big chapter of its development. Cantrixil is really still just finishing up the first chapter of its development. So partly some of that attention reflects just the very much earlier stage of development of the drug. I think partly because of that, though, it is fair to say that right now investors probably look primarily to GDC84 as the driver of value in the company. Now, they may be right in that, they may be wrong, but I think we have to recognize that that is where people see the driver of value in the company, and we have to be able to sort of respond to that, I guess, in terms of how we talk about it. So I do think Cantrixil is a drug with enormous promise. I think it's just got a little bit further to go before we can really demonstrate that to the satisfaction of investors. I think one of the things we're mindful of is that if you look at GDC84, the path to market, the journey that it's got to go on to become a marketed product, is pretty linear. It's one pivotal study now in glioblastoma, and then it wins or it doesn't. So it's a pretty straight journey to get there, pretty straight shot. For Cantrixil, it is a more complicated story because there are quite a few other drugs already available for ovarian cancer. There are other drugs coming through the global pipeline for ovarian cancer. There's a lot of different places where Cantrixil could offer benefit to patients with ovarian cancer. And because of that, the phase 2 program for Cantrixil is not quite so linear. For example, it would probably involve several clinical trials in phase 2 rather than just one as for GDC84. So I think for those reasons more than anything else, we actually think that the drug would be best served by having a larger company involved. Now, whether they take it on wholesale or whether we partner with them in some way, I think we're completely open to that. And sometimes you start with one arrangement and it metamorphoses into the other. So I think there's really no fixed points there, but I think as much as anything, just because of the demands of what the Cantrixil program would need to be successful, we think that bringing a partner on earlier rather than later is the best way forward for the drug. So I think that's really what's reflected there in those comments. No, I think that. And as I mentioned, there's really 2 ways this go. We either get an early signal that says, yes, it looks like the drug's working, or we get, frankly, a result where we say it's just a bit too early. We opened the oven door before the cake was ready. Let's close it and wait another 10 minutes. And that's possible as well. So what I think, we hopefully don't. The only thing that I think would be a true negative result here is if we get some really severe new safety thing that was unheralded. Suddenly 5 of the patients go into liver failure or something horrible like that. Or if we're seeing, patients that are frankly progressing within weeks, instead of 5 months, then that would be a cause for concern. But the reality of clinical trials is you do get most of the information towards the end. This is an early look. So. In some diseases that would be true. In brain cancer, there's still there is still nothing else really. So for these patients with this unmethylated MGMT promoter, that's to say the ones that are resistant to temozolomide, the official US cancer care guidelines, the algorithm for treating cancer, recommends for these patients that first-line treatment should be consider clinical trial participation, which is a very unusual thing to see in these guidelines, because it basically is a recognition we haven't got any drugs that work. And and sad to say, the outcome for this form of brain cancer has not improved in 20 years. So unfortunately, these patients are really no better off than they were at the turn of the millennium, and the appetite for getting into clinical trial is commensurate with that. So as Mark's mentioned, there's 4 other PI3K inhibitors on the market. They all unambiguously work. They're all being used to treat quite different forms of cancer. So the first 3 are being used to treat blood cancers of various types. And then the 4th one is being used to treat breast cancer. The 3 blood cancer agents work reasonably well in very difficult disease populations. The new breast cancer drug from Novartis, people are very excited about. There's very, very strong data that's come out of the clinical trials there. That seems to really do very good things. But they're very different diseases. So we've just got to bear that in mind. Every cancer, every patient population, every drug is a little bit different. So although it's broadly encouraging, I think we always have to just kind of look at this in context. You make a really interesting point about GDC84, which is that the unique thing about our drug is that it gets into the brain, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and that obviously makes it uniquely relevant for brain cancer. But in every other respect, it is no less of a drug than these other PI3K inhibitors. There's nothing those drugs fundamentally have in a biological sense that we don't. So there's no reason in principle why GDC84 couldn't, in the fullness of time, be looked at in breast cancer, in lung cancer, in prostate cancer, in bowel cancer, in any of the diseases that people have been looking at PI3K inhibitors for. Now, we haven't gone after those diseases straight out the door because obviously there's a lot of competition. They're generally expensive diseases to develop new drugs for. But if we're successful in brain cancer, I think that's a fantastic platform to start looking at other opportunities for the drug. So, and that's often the way it works with new drugs. If you look at a drug like Avastin, for instance, that started off in colorectal cancer. It's now used in everything from ovarian cancer, breast cancer, you name it. So, very often new cancer drugs start off with one lead indication and then spread out from there. So, hopefully that will be the trajectory for GDC84 as well. Historically, people haven't tended to try and develop a lot of new drugs for brain cancer for a couple of reasons. One is that it's seen as being a very, very technically difficult disease to treat, particularly because of this issue around the blood-brain barrier. So getting drugs that can get to the tumor has just been a very, very significant challenge. So a lot of companies have shied away from that. And frankly, over the last 20 years, there have been larger opportunities. So for example, lung cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, there's a lot more patients. And so very crudely speaking, the bigger companies have tended to chase those indications in the hope that they represent bigger commercial opportunities. Now that tide has started to turn, because if we look, for example, at lung cancer, in the last decade, there have been 20 new lung cancer drugs approved by FDA. So that's getting to be quite a congested space now. And what's happening is that as new drugs come along, they're carving that disease up into very, very specific little groups. So to give you an example, in lung cancer, there's a particular group of lung cancer patients called ALK positive patients. And that represents about 2% of all lung cancer patients. There are 3 FDA approved drugs for ALK positive lung cancer. So that's how niche it's starting to get in some of these bigger patient populations. And with that, we're starting to see diseases like glioblastoma become much more significant in comparison. So I think in that sense, the tide is turning in the favor of these slightly less common cancers like brain cancer. I think the challenge is still that a lot of people have tried and failed. And so, frankly, big pharma companies go after the easier targets. And but again, I think people are starting to see that that these things are manageable. For a long time, melanoma was seen as just a disease that nobody could help. We saw no progress in melanoma until about 6, 7, 8 years ago. We started seeing a whole load of new drugs coming on melanoma. It has changed the face of that disease fundamentally. So, as I often say, everything is impossible until somebody does it. And I think that will be the case with brain cancer as well. But having said that, at this point, there really is not much else out there in the global pipeline for glioblastoma. We periodically look at what every other company's doing, and I think I could say with confidence that right now we honestly don't see anything in the global pipeline that is more advanced than GDC84, has more compelling data in this patient population, and is under active development for the disease. So,
James, how big is the market in brain cancer?
In glioblastoma, so in this particular form, the most aggressive form of brain cancer, the most common and most aggressive form of brain cancer, most of the analysis sizes the global market at about $1.5 billion US. So that's roughly the size of the prize. Now, things like brain metastases, so cancer that's spread from somewhere else in the brain, somewhere else in the body to the brain, that's all upside. So, for example, breast cancer brain metastases, we think is probably about $3 billion right now. So, ballpark terms, that's the sort of size of the market.